supported with timekeeping. So my colleague Nicola Johnson is going to help us with the timekeeping. And then once we are finished with that, we will move to a Q&A session. Let me just tell you what we hope to achieve from this session. So this session will sensitize participants to the historical and colonial legacies that continue to shape education systems and practices across the Caribbean, and to indigenize and decolonize strategies that support the creation of inclusive and safe spaces for culturally responsive leading, learning, and teaching practices to flourish. So colleagues, we invite you to enter into this space for us to think about our historical antecedents continue to be rehearsed within our education systems. But before we begin, I have a question. Most of you who know me well know that I'm a primary school teacher, so it's very difficult for me to stay still. I'm accustomed to moving around the room. Yeah? How many of you have ever thought, why, despite so many investments, millions, billions of dollars in investments, our education system is not changing and we are still not seeing the outcomes that we want to achieve? How many of you have thought about that? Raise your hand. Yeah? Good. So I'm hoping that at the end of this session, not only do we begin to get an inclination as to why those practices remain entrenched, but also that we are beginning to think through clear action points and solutions for displacing those practices. We are not replacing, because the fear with replacing is that we replace one tyranny for another. So we are seeking to displace practices that tend to keep us in a political and colonial frame of thinking. With that, we will start with Dr. Ramona Archer Bradshaw. And give me a minute, let me just introduce you to Dr. Bradshaw. Dr. Archer Bradshaw was appointed Chief Education Officer to the Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training in 2021, and was responsible for the introduction of coding and robotics across the primary and secondary school levels in Barbados. She played an important role in transitioning the nation's education system from face-to-face to distributed and remote teaching and learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Bradshaw has also been responsible for the conceptualization of the island's ambitious education transformation agenda, reimagining education in Barbados, a bright future for every child. Dr. Bradshaw, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Bristol. Good morning, colleagues. As you heard, my name is Ramona Archer Bradshaw. I'm the Chief Education Officer, Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training in Barbados. And I stand here in the stead of my minister, the Minister of Education, Technological and Vocational Training, the Honorable Kay McConney. It is my distinct pleasure to stand before you this morning to discuss this topic of indigenizing and decolonizing education for national and regional transformation. As I thought about the topic, I cast my mind back to the quote by Nelson Mandela. He said that education is the most powerful weapon that can be used to change the world. This is indeed true. And in as much as we know it, our colonial masters knew it as well. When we consider Barbados, an island, 166 square miles, roughly about 270,000 people, an education system that some would say is a very high quality education system. We have about 21 secondary schools, 68 primary schools, 12 nursery schools, 4 special education schools, And these are all public schools. And in terms of private schools, we have about 27 to 30 private schools, and these private schools are small. In Barbados, education, basic education, is for students between 5 and 16 years old, and that is compulsory. At the tertiary level, our students are given the opportunity to access that level of education, and that's funded by the government of Barbados. For us, indeed, education is the most powerful weapon that can be used to change the world. However, the way that our education system is fashioned is still a replica of the colonial model that promoted a system that favored a few and cast away many. Education, in terms of its content areas, its methodologies, its practices, its policies for the transfer of knowledge, continues to promote a system that is grounded in elitism and separation, if we are indeed honest with ourselves. So before we can begin to transform our education system, we must first think about deconstructing our views of our education system. And I'm going to begin by talking a bit about the history of education in Barbados. Our history shows that the slave code was passed in Barbados in 1661. And you might ask yourselves, what is the slave code? The slave code is an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes. And it is the first comprehensive slave act that defined the way of life for slaves in Barbados. It denied the rights to slaves and allowed them to be classified as chattel or property instead of human beings. And this act marked the beginning of the legal codification of slavery. We must remember, though, that the abolition of slavery in Barbados started in 1834, and full emancipation was achieved in 1838. We must also remember that the movement towards educating slaves in any real way only began in 1823, but that was done with a purpose. The education sought to prepare slaves for eventual freedom by Christianizing and civilizing them in an effort to protect the plantation economic system. We must also understand that the emergence of education in Barbados and the rest of the region was not rooted in any ideology of liberation and empowerment. Its initial origin stemmed from the need of colonial powers to have a tool by which they could continue to inculcate within the psyche of the soon-to-be ex-slaves those English values which would become the mental shackles to preserve the legacy of colonialism upon the emancipation of the enslaved population. In reading about the writings of Assistant Professor of History Olwyn Bluett, he proposes that the aim of education was to ensure that the island of Barbados moved from an economic and social system based on slavery to one that is based on freedom with the least amount of dislocation and turmoil. He stated that it was hoped that the spread of Christian civilized behavior would prevent the Black population from reverting to Barbadianism, withdrawal of plantation labor, and would save the social and economic system from decay. I want us to think about that. Education was therefore employed as a mechanism by which ex-slave masters would continue the forced indoctrination of the ex-slave populations into obedience, docility, and acceptance of their circumstances. While the introduction of free education and a common entrance exam in 1959 would have been classified as bold moves, which attempted to redress some of the inequities of our colonial legacy, and while in several respects they have served our country well, many of those 20th century initiatives are no longer enough to meet the dynamic changing needs of this global digital age in which we live. However, we, the people of the Caribbean, must be commended for taking the worst of anything and making the best of it. In Barbados, there's a dish called pudding and sauce, where the sauce is made from what are deemed to be scraps of the pig, like the ears and the snout and the feet, the parts that were not so desired by the then master. And we have added ingredients to it to make it one of the most tasty and sought after dishes on Saturdays in Barbados. We have done the same with education. Utilizing a system that was meant to oppress, suppress, and depress, to become educated to a degree that could allow us to pull ourselves out of poverty and use the knowledge, attitudes, and skills gained in the classroom for advancement in an agricultural and service economy. But is it enough to take the scraps and the remains, the remnants of a colonial education to make something of it? Or is it time for us to remove our lenses, deconstruct our views of education, and reconstruct systems that are fair, inclusive, relevant, and modern? Is it enough to tweak a system that was intentionally created to disempower? Or is it time to transform our education system from the root? To answer these questions, there's a need for us to introspect. Who are we? Why are we doing what we are doing? And what kind of future do we want for ourselves? We must also be willing to change the educational structures and systems to redress the psychosocial, cultural, and other inefficiencies which have emerged because of our colonial roots. Decolonization must not be captured only as an abstract ideological position, but it must be actualized through strategic action which seeks to change how things are currently done. It is not a one-shot event, but a journey towards education transformation. According to Rosemary Campbell Stevens, an experienced educational consultant and leadership coach, we must move from colonized roots to decolonized fruits. So, what are we doing? What are we doing? I can tell you what we are doing in Barbados. The transformation journey from colonized roots to decolonized fruits accurately captures the ideology of decolonization and was the theme of a series of workshops to which our system leaders in education were exposed during our summer training series in 2023. We cannot talk transformation unless we know who we are. And this is the reason we engage our system leaders in these workshops. These sessions, which were facilitated by leadership consultant and educator Rosemary Campbell Stevens, effectively set the stage for our leaders to be engaged with the conversation surrounding the need for structural changes to make our system more responsive to our current needs. Decolonized structures are those which seek to leave debilitating bureaucratic processes behind in favor of more strategic but collaborative forms of governance. It speaks to the value of mentorship, the need to increase institutional accountability, and encourages the adoption of organizational processes which promote initiative and innovation across the education system. Organization, rules, and guidelines must be purpose driven and must make sense within the context of institutional aims and should not hinder progress. Recently, I attended a lecture by Dr. Bristol, and she spoke about making sense in common. Very often we rely on something called common sense, but it is more important to make sense in common. And if you want to learn more about that, you can engage Dr. Bristol as well. But it's about making sense in common to craft our future. As a ministry, therefore, we have been engaged in wide ranging consultations where we have examined our current internal organization structures and job functions with the view of maximizing system wide operations of the ministry so that it is better positioned to meet the needs of its various clients and stakeholders. These processes have been led by a SWOT analysis, by the building out of a strategic plan, which has identified strategic goals, objectives, and priority action areas, which are currently engaging the attention of the ministry as a whole. We have also received permission from the Ministry of the Public Service for the establishment of several posts designed to operationalize identified transformation initiatives at both the level of central administration and at the school level. To this end, the ministry's transformation agenda is now being supported by a new change management unit and by a strategic innovation unit. At our school level, the creation of master teacher posts for soon implementation is intended to provide the requisite instructional support to teachers so that they can better serve the needs of our students. The decolonization of structures must be seen not as an empty promise, but as the emergence over time of a more responsive and supportive system where strategic inputs are required for the realization of strategic outcomes. In terms of our curriculum, what are we doing? We recognize that any attempt at decolonizing curricula must begin with the acknowledgement of the inherent biases that we possess and the inherent biases within our curricula, our approaches, and our methodologies. The democratization of knowledge through the growth of the internet means that our students now have uninhibited access to knowledge, and hence the idea of the fount of all knowledge teacher expert who dominates the learning space no longer bears relevance to how we want our students to assume ownership of their learning. This reality should automatically shift the balance of learning power in the classroom by allowing students to understand that they can lead in the pursuit of knowledge in a student-centered way, where teachers are not sages on the stage, but are guides by the side. As a Ministry of Education, our commitment to this recalibration of teaching and learning is currently being facilitated through a range of training and professional development sessions, which we have held since commencing this current iteration towards education transformation. Our system of consultation has been one of the widest held in education in Barbados to date, as we have brought both educational leaders and teachers from across the system together to listen to their ideas. We've listened to their concerns, and we have examined also the status of education in Barbados. To date, we have engaged over 4,000 partners in education, and this includes leaders, teachers, students, parents, religious organizations to find out what people want to see in their current education system. This speaks to our approach of communication and collaboration. In response to much of what has been shared and through our own assessment of training needs, we have initiated summer institutes for professional development where our senior officials, education officers, and school leaders have been exposed to more student-centered approaches. For example, the project-based learning approach, where we would wish for our students to be engaged in critical thinking, to be more collaborative, to be problem solvers, to be innovators, to be creators rather than consumers. This is what we want our system to look like. In terms of PBL, this was designed to empower pedagogues with the skills required to develop the 21st century skills. It allows students to view knowledge as something that is not confined in a textbook, but as a living, dynamic tool which they can utilize to answer the real challenges facing the globe today. Our officers at the ministry have also been exposed to the strategies for monitoring and implementation of the project-based learning, and these features must remain prominent but ongoing elements of the transformation trajectory. And you will realize that this too is different from what we are accustomed to, where our teachers give instruction to the students, our students receive the instruction as best as they could, and then regurgitate it in an exam. We are trying to shift the way that teaching and learning occurs in our classroom, because if we want to create those persons who can produce, we need to start with the whole idea of critical thinking. Through other ministry-led initiatives and programs at the level of student development, for example, the Future Forward Schools Innovation Challenge and other student-focused programs, and through the growth and development of our own National Students' Council, we have witnessed a demonstrated rise in student leadership, student voice, and student advocacy. These have become critical components of a newer paradigm for education, which is governed by student to teacher and student to student collaboration, inclusivity, and student ownership of learning. Students have become more sensitized to the global issues of the environment and of social justice, and are growing in confidence in their articulation of the many concerns and challenges which face our youth. While the journey towards newer pathways for learning has begun, to meet our objectives, we are cognizant of the need to continue ongoing training and professional development of teachers at all levels. In this regard, through partnerships with our own and lone teacher training institute, the Earlston Teachers Training College, and Columbia University, there are currently government-funded professional development and training programs being facilitated in the areas of teacher efficacy and teacher leadership. Apart from teacher training, expanding curricular offerings so that areas of study are more relevant to current national, regional, and global needs is also critical. As a ministry, we are therefore expanding our curriculum to include studies in the blue and green economies, climate sciences, life sciences, digital literacies, financial literacy, coding and robotics, studies in the orange economy, entrepreneurship, and the expansion of technical and vocational studies. Some of these programs are already on stream. Partnerships with our own National Cultural Foundation and with the Division of Culture in the Prime Minister's office provide evidence of our ministry's growing sensitization towards heritage and cultural studies, and to the need to include these components as valuable parts of the school curriculum. So we ask ourselves questions like, why do we teach history? Whose history are we teaching? These partnerships have been strategic, especially as it relates to the infusion of the intangible cultural heritage components within our schools, where apart from the performing arts, students have been exposed to training in the more indigenous areas like tuck music, steel pan music, stilt walking, the land ship, and to African games like potter and wari. What we are trying to do is that we are trying to bring back the Barbadianism that the colonial rule was trying to suppress. While external experts in these areas are currently utilizing schools, developing these competencies in our teachers to enable more of them to infuse intangible cultural heritage principles and content areas in the regular classroom through integrated approaches to the curriculum is highly desired. Apart from the provision of formal teaching, teachers are also encouraged to build professional learning communities among themselves so that there are greater levels of knowledge sharing, collaboration, and collective support for the realization of student outcomes in all areas. So, what lessons have we learned? Well, I must say that consideration must be given to continuously expanding the capacity of all educators and pedagogues across the system so that their competencies and skills are kept abreast with the rapid changes occurring in education. We cannot educate a 21st century citizen using 19th century models. At the same time, decolonization and indigenization, as separate but relatable arms of a transformation continuum, must not only include changed ideologies and the embracing of cultural and heritage based components, but it must also include providing teachers with the resources, the infrastructure, and the financial support that they need to publish in both print and digital format culturally relevant resources for teaching and learning. Forging ongoing partnerships with critical stakeholder groups remains a priority on the pathway towards educational transformation with its underlying vision for decolonization and indigenization. The ministry has indeed consulted and partnered with a diverse group of public and private sector bodies as it has shared its vision for education transformation. This has included corporate entities, the faith based community, national parent teachers associations and other parent groups, the unions, health and social services sectors, and psychosocial agencies, among others. These relationships must be built on authentic collaboration and trust as we commit to listening to the concerns raised by these bodies, even as we enlist their support. Similarly, at the level of the school, principals are encouraged to broaden their view of their school communities so that beyond the obvious engagement with students, teachers, parents, staff, and others, there is the forging of ties with the wider local community of their schools. This may include community members who use the facilities, the alumni, the church groups, or community clubs. What is also critical to the agenda for change will be a stronger emphasis on mental health and wellness, physical wellness, student psychosocial support, and the development of critical social and emotional skills. Okay. I will end, I understand. Thank you, Dr. Bristol, by saying that decolonization demands a recognition of the fact that all students are not the same. And the equitable education requires that we create systems, structures, programs, and curricula to meet these needs. We indeed have to create a local and regional education that can be the most powerful weapon that can change the world. It must start by understanding who we are, leveraging what we have learned, and then unlocking our full potential. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Archer Bradshaw. I think one of the key takeaway messages, and I know that it resonated with the people in the room, when you said we cannot educate in the 21st century using 18th century pedagogies. So we Thank you for that. We're moving right along. I hope you're taking notes of your questions, asking about implications for what we really do in the classroom and how we transform not just what we do in the classroom, but we transform the minds of our teachers who are serving and working with our students in the classroom, and transform the way in which we organize the delivery and governance of education. These are not esoteric conversations, clear implications for what we do, for how we do, and we must start by knowing who we are and where we came from. So moving right along, I want to introduce our next speaker, Professor Joel Warrican. Professor Warrican is the director for the Caribbean Education Research Center within the Faculty of Humanities and Education. And as we like to jokingly say now, I'm his boss, at the University of the West Indies, Cayville campus in Barbados. He has produced a body of scholarship in literacy in the Caribbean context, where issues such as influences of a colonial past and democracy in education in small island developing nations have implications for the characteristics and diversity in classrooms, multilingualism, and multiculturalism. And these must be taken into account when we begin to talk about literacy education. He advocates for change in literacy education and education in general, and promotes the benefits of empirical evidence to support educational policy, planning, and practice. He also promotes transformative education as a viable alternative to the traditional approach to education that is common in the region. He has a keen interest in comparative education, especially when linked to language and culture and the use of technology, especially new technologies in education. Professor Warrican has served on the CARICOM Task Force for Teaching and Teacher Education. With that, we welcome Professor Warrican, who will engage us for another 25 minutes. Professor Warrican.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Okay. So, as Dr. Ramona Bradshaw spoke, I had to take note of a few things, and a number of things jumped out at me. That colonization has not done us well. I think we have to agree with that. There was nothing kind about colonization. You know, it came across in a very paternalistic way, and they knew what was best for us, but there was nothing kind about it. It has been an education that has kept us in bondage. And we say, oh, we are no longer slaves, we are no longer indentured servants, etc. But mentally, we do have a problem. If we didn't have a problem, we would not be doing education as we do it today. With a common entrance exam that many ministers across the region have said, so if not the common entrance, then what? Many senior teachers have said that. Many education officers, many principals, what is the alternative, they say. And if we as a people cannot come up with an alternative, it means that something is wrong. We are still in bondage. It's an education that is all about inequity, classism. That's why we have certain types of schools, and I'll get to that. And of course, it is an education that has not promoted inclusivity. So, certain people are sidelined in our education system. If you have a special need, believe it or not, unless you have good parents who know how to play the game, your child is in trouble. And need not even be a special need, might just be a little bit delayed. You know, it's not an easy system that we have here in the Caribbean. Look at the CXC results. And we talk about all the types of reasons. For example, we talk about literacy. But even though we're talking about literacy, to say literacy is a problem, go on the websites, international websites, and you will see literacy rates in the Caribbean ranging from 90 to 100%. What a paradox. How could that be? How could that be? We have problems. But Davian made a point, which I have to correct. Davian said that Belize, the land of the Garifuna, and that is true. except that you neglected to say that the origins of the Garifuna people are from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But I'm not saying this just for the little amusement, because this is a hallmark of what colonialism was about. We talk about an evil system, think about it. So the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they were first indigenous people there. And during the slave trade, many slaves jumped overboard in the Caribbean waters or where they were shipwrecked, and they swam to St. Vincent. Off Barbados, they got to St. Vincent. Also, the British brought some slaves. But you need to know that slavery never became entrenched in St. Vincent and the Grenadines until 1796. We did not have the same experience as the rest of the Caribbean. Why? The indigenous people, what the Europeans call the Caribs. That's what's not their names, but you know, they give them their own names. They joined with these African slaves and they resisted slavery. And this went on until 1796, when those people, known as the Garifuna, that's the intermarriage between the indigenous people and the Africans, to form a new race called the Garifuna. They were defeated in 1796. And to make sure that there will be no more resistance, the British did what they usually do: divide and conquer. They sent them to Belize and the rest of Central America. Those who remain in St. Vincent, so we are people of Garifuna background. We do not speak the Garifuna language. Do we know any other group like that? All of us African slaves, we no longer speak the language from where we came because of the divide and conquer rule. Don't put too many people of the same language on the same plantation in the same space. Language was used to rule. So what am I going to cover today? The legacies from a colonial past, and a lot of it I don't have to go through because Dr. Ramona Bradshaw did so well on that. Impact of a colonial past on education today, and indigenizing education for national and regional transformation. And I'll be looking at school and structure, teacher recruitment, curriculum content, assessment practices, transition policies, and paternalistic funding models. School structure. I know I'm limited with time, so we'll not spend a lot of time on these. So we have this thing that in some other speeches that I've done, I've referred to it as a demon, this common entrance exam. It's like a demon. It is so tricky that every parent in the Caribbean think this is something good. That it is that exam at 11 years old that give my child that opportunity to get a better education. And if a government wants to move it, then you hear the outcries because everybody believes that that opportunity is going to be plucked away from my child. It is something that has to go. But what has it done? It has created a hierarchical structure where you had the former grammar schools. These are the schools that the British, you've heard about Cyril Burt, that famous psychologist from the infamous psychologist from the UK, who, in advising the government, said that some people were inferior. Those are the ones they sent to the secondary modern. These were not black children. These were not Pakistani children or Indian children. Those were the ones, that went to the secondary modern school. The white, bright child went to the former grammar schools and then the technical schools. We have inherited this system. So in every country, in the region, we have these schools that we hold dear, and nobody can touch them. Nobody can touch them because there's a good school, bad school. And many of us, people like us, we went to these so-called good schools. So we do not want that system to be shaken up. We want to make sure that our children go to those types of schools. Elitism, classism, we have to remove that. And then teacher recruitment. Once upon a time, we recruited from the primary school during the colonial period, from primary schools, called a pupil-teacher system. That is who they put to teach our kids. Little children from primary school, not yet reached the age of majority, but they taught. You know what is interesting? I grew up in this system. It went on for a long time. In St. Vincent, I think, and the Grenadines, I think it ended in 1984. But what stands out for me is those people, these people who are teachers, so-called teachers from the primary school. They were in school a few days in the week teaching, and then for 2 days they will go to the pupil teacher system. But I've witnessed the principal of my primary school flogging those same teachers because they were still students, 15 years old, 14 years old, and they were treated as children. That is the system we had. So has it changed? We moved along the line and we start plucking secondary school children to teach. And then now we're plucking university students to teach. But here what? In the past, they didn't have the content knowledge. Because how much does a primary school child know? Nowadays, they have the content knowledge because they have a university education, but they're still not fit to teach because they do not have the pedagogical knowledge. And you teach a few years before you get teacher trained. That is the system. See how the legacy continues? And it is very, very, very problematic because content knowledge, what we think is content knowledge, is often not content knowledge. You have a degree in mathematics, but you know what? We have discovered that many of these teachers with a degree in mathematics, put them in the primary school, and they do not understand how to teach mathematics at that level. Because the content you do, the abstract algebra and the calculus, is not quite the same. And then our curriculum content. Remember, out of colonialism, the great books were the thing. You know, you had to be able to quote Shakespeare and all of these great literature texts. Now, have things changed very much? Remember, that was the days of something called perennialism, that philosophy of perennialism. The teacher was the font of knowledge. The teacher knew it all. And part of the philosophy of perennialism is that the child was bad. The child was an empty vessel to be filled. Those are the concepts. How has that really changed? Don't we still see the teachers wanting to teach in a way as our children are empty vessels to be filled? Nothing much has changed. Assessment practices, and we talk about the the common entrance exam. The British called it the screening test. But in the Caribbean, we got it wrong. The kids used to think that they were saying the screaming test. And you know what? It was an apt term because when the results come out, there was lots of screaming. And colleagues, let's not forget, across the region, this assessment has been so evil that there are children who run away on the day of results, children who harm themselves, children who commit suicide because they can't face the society, and of course, children who get licks like peas because they didn't do well. Even though everything showed, leading up to this, that this child was not going to pass this exam. But on the day of reckoning, they were still flogged as if it was going to do some kind of good. Our transition policies, movement from primary to secondary, it helped to segregate our people by ability. Saying that because you pass the common entrance, you have greater ability. But that is not true. When you live in a middle-class home, I always say, my children will do well because I know how to play the education game. I know what to do. I will plug out the money if I have to pay for extra lessons. That's what middle-class people do. And so their children do very well, and we think they're so bright, but they're not brighter than those who didn't do well. You know how to play the game. We've got to change that. We've got to make it equitable for everybody. That's how we do it. And the funding models. This is born out of colonialism, where the colonial masters decided how much money they were going to give to us. But when they give it to our education, they dictated how things go. In fact, when the person came down from the UK, they would check to make sure that X number of teachers are here, they're doing this, that the curriculum is followed, and so forth. They were ensuring. Now, this is modern day. It's not colonization anymore, but it's modern day colonization, which we call coloniality. And we are not saying that there's anything wrong with having funding agencies, but do we allow them to dictate our agenda? That is the key. And sometimes when they don't even want to dictate the agenda, we seem to want direction from them as to how we should spend this money. So what I'm talking about is a two-way street that it is built into us that we should be dependent. We have to get out of that mold. Divide and conquer. The worst thing to me in our Caribbean space is to see the insularity that exists in the Caribbean, that we all want to operate on our own. We all want to tick our own boxes to say we have done this, rather than coming together and working together. There's no reason why any single Caribbean country, and we are all talking the same language these days about transformation, each country. There's no reason why we shouldn't be tackling transformation, education transformation, as a group, as a region, not as a country. But we were taught to divide and conquer. We were taught to be separated. We are not having ministries of education working together. And even when they work together, they still go back home and do their own thing. So that when we come to these type of meetings, we can stand up and say, we have done X, Y, Z, ticking boxes. We've got to move from ticking boxes. We've got to become productive. So the impact of our colonial past on education today, I'll just quickly go through. Divisiveness, stratification of society, unhealthy competition, marginalization of large portions of youth, and we wonder why the crime rates are so bad, so high. When you have young people leaving school without certification, because we have adopted something called CXC, coming out of GCO level, that marginalize people. Nothing is wrong with CXC, my brother. But what is wrong with it? Nothing is wrong with the organization, having an organization like that. What is wrong with it is to have a system of examination like that, that marginalize so many people. Youth diverse from community. Very uncaring societies we are having nowadays. Not care about property, not care about people, not being our brother and sister keeper. These are problems that we have. Lack of entrepreneurial thinking. We have children leaving school that just want a job because our education did not help them to become entrepreneurial. Absence of strong support for innovation. We are about regurgitation. We are not about hands-on. We are not about creativity and building things, innovating. We're not doing those things. We've got to change that. Distrust of locally or regionally generated solutions for educational issues. This is my biggest pet peeve right now. We prefer to take books from North America. We prefer to take the solutions from North America. We prefer to take all the things that are deemed good there, but nothing from our region or even from the global south. We see it in a very distrustful way. So we want an EMIS solution, something to manage our data. We are going to prefer to go to something created overseas rather than do something that comes from the region. We still have school systems in this region that are using American readers rather than Caribbean readers. But the truth is, I have not seen any good Caribbean reader. Let us be frank. Putting some stories together and having some comprehension questions, not enough. It has to be sound educational principles that we do. We've got to do it right. We can't say we want to indigenize and decolonize, but think that all we have to do is to produce it here. No, we have to follow good, sound education principles. That is the key. I'll move on to the purpose of education. We have to gradually reverse the effects of the divide and conquer strategy. That has to go. I must emphasize, we must work together. We are a very similar people, a very similar region. We have differences, of course. So as we work together, we must recognize the particularity of each country. But that does not mean we go on different paths. We find the similarities and we work there. And then the individual particularity, that can be worked on at a national level. Unite the community rather than stratify and marginalize. We have to have an education that is more community-oriented, service learning, and all of this thing. Not this education that is predicated on exams, high-stakes exams. Exams are necessary, but it cannot be the only thing. Cannot be the only thing. Community-based learning. Promote local and regional solutions that are homegrown and meet international standards. So back to that, it must meet the standards. So we do it this way. We do it regionally. We look inwards, but at the same time, we know that we operate in a global space. So whatever we produce must be good enough to stand up to international scrutiny. So indigenizing. Update content. We have to integrate. We have to include non-traditional content to incorporate essential knowledge and skills. We need to help students to develop critical thinking skills. Example, when they communicate, critical literacies and skills of inquiry. Teacher education, that needs something of an overhaul, and we are already on that path, but a lot needs to be done. So we have to promote, for example, adaptability, skills in integrating technology, collaboration, learning communities. And our assessment procedure, greater emphasis on assessment as learning and assessment for learning, rather than mostly on assessment of learning. We've got to have that shift. Our assessment tools, we need to develop our own assessment tools in the region. We can't have psychological tools that were normed in North America and the UK. being used to make judgments on our children. Policies and regulation, again, to replace the divide and conquer. And then, of course, we need research. Too many times we are making policy decisions and practice decisions without it being grounded in research. We have got to do the research in the region. And that's where our center, the Caribbean Educational Research Center, comes in. And then the funding models. We need to shift from funding just for projects that when they end, there's no continuity. I'm suggesting that we think about a seed funding model also that will allow individuals, give individuals seed money to be able to create, to be able to innovate. Because if it is solely in the hands of ministries, they're going to do it within certain parameters. When individuals have seed money or organizations, they're able to be that creative, innovative creature that they want to be. So, no local solution is good unless it comes from outside. That is something that we have learned. And then there's open mistrust of locally generated ideas, products, data solutions. We have got to change all of those type of things. And as I wrap up, we've got to create, we've got to produce, we've got to develop, we've got to establish new things, we've got to seek a different funding model, and we have to have proper support systems. And the last thing, there are some essential elements that I think we should focus on as we think about education in the region. Creativity, a non-partisan approach can be about, when you think in education, we have to remove the politics. You want to have transformation, the opposition and the government have to sit at the same table, because tomorrow opposition is in power. That goes without saying. We have to think about how we do it financially. And I want to end on two: courageous leadership. We need courageous leaders. At the political level, the only way we're going to remove the common entrance exam is a government, a minister of education, a prime minister who is bold enough to know that I'm going to lose votes. Because this thing is political, you know? And then the last one is research. I'm imploring the region. We have got to embrace research. We cannot continue to do business as usual. We cannot continue in a way that we think if we think it, it is good. If it is commonsensical, it is good. In education, many things that are commonsensical is not borne out by research. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Warrican. You see why we have this joke and you see who really is the boss, right? Yeah. A lot of food for thought. I kept looking at the audience and I know that many of you have many questions. Dr. Warrican, Professor Warrican, just one point of clarification. You said that those of us here went to good schools. I didn't go to a good school.
I didn't say that. I said we'll ensure that our children
Go to good schools. But I'm not a good school student. I didn't go to a good school. For those of you who know Trinidad and Tobago, I went to a junior secondary school, Five Rivers Junior Secondary. And I'm very proud to be a graduate of Five Rivers Junior Secondary. So we are in a space for dialogue. We're in a space for discussion. We're in a space for us to articulate in common with Dr. Bradshaw and Professor Warrican and our colleagues here in this community to begin to clearly articulate some key points of action for indigenizing and decolonizing our education system as we begin to talk about truly transforming education. I now turn the floor over to you. Just raise your hands. I think, do we have mics roving? Because I know we are live streaming. Do we have mics roving? Yes, thank you. We have the first question from Dr. Ali here. Just raise your hands. I will see you and I will invite you to the floor. So, Devian? Edward.
For live streaming purposes, we have to
We
stand
want
in about
people
this
to come into
area.
a bubble. Okay, good.
Right.
So maybe you can come up to where Davian is. Davian, where you are? Excellent. Or you want to use it's a little bit. Yeah. Thank you. And I saw one other hand in the corner here. Thank you. Saw your hand, and we'll keep going. Dr.
Thank you
Ali.
very much. Good morning to all. It was really thought-provoking. As a researching practitioner in the area of looking at education policy and transformation in the region for many years, one of the things that I have found from my research, which I've heard both of you speak about, and I've heard you, Professor Warrican, in the end mention the issue of courageous leadership. Quite often, leadership impacts everything else we talk about within transformational contexts. So I would really like you, if you can both expound, both within the Barbadian context and within the Caribbean context, how you see courageous leadership impacting transformation in the region from a decolonized perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Edward. Courageous leadership has to be at different levels. So I'm saying, as I mentioned previously, at the political level, you need a minister of education, you need a prime minister who must recognize what the challenges are in education and would be bold enough to want to make those changes. So many of the things we identified here, they've got to see those things that are affecting our education system and be willing to put their necks out on the block to deal with them. These are controversial issues. Going into a formal grammar school or not going into a formal grammar school is a major controversial issue. So how do you say to a people who have had their top school getting students who eventually become prime ministers and governor generals and ambassadors and so forth, that they're going to accept children who seem not to have, not to have any chances of doing that. So it has to be a very bold move. So as you do that, you've got to then find a way to make sure that it is not a superficial change. It is substantive, that what is going to be done in the name of education, that even if it takes a year or two or a few years, eventually people are going to see that it is a good thing. But it's tricky and it's difficult. In the region, many of these top schools, and I say top in inverted commas at all time, they're often in places like in the city, some bordering depressed areas, that if you say children from these neighborhoods would go to that school, so you go to a zoning thing, then you have a certain type of children that's going to go to these traditionally top schools that many of the people who have gone there do not want to see happen, because they want to see a certain type of people to continue their legacy. So politicians have got to think about it, and they've got to make sure they get it right. At the ministry level, we need to have strong technocrats. We need people who would be able to stand up to politicians and say, this is how it goes. I believe that normally it is the other way around, that the politicians dictate. And we have to understand politics is politics and the boss is the boss. But if you are grounded in education, you should be able to guide that politician properly, to help them to understand this is what we should be doing and this is why. And then at the school level, we need to have principals who are strong, principals who are not promoted as principals just because they're party supporters. And that goes to the ministry also. They can't be just party supporters, or they can't just have been good teachers. Good teachers don't always translate to good leaders. Good cricketers don't always translate to good captains, So we need to maybe have a leadership institute, a regional leadership institute, where we train our potential CEOs, or potential principals, or potential teacher leaders as to how they can become what we want, how they can self-actualize. And then we, of course, have to put a support system in place for them. Just like how teachers need a support system. Show me in as chief education officer. I've never done this before. The other chief has retired and gone, and I have a job to do that I don't quite know how to go about it. When maybe if you have somebody there guiding and helping, a coach, not even, it doesn't have to be a coach from that country, that may help.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for the question, Eduardo. I fully support what was said by Professor Warikan, but I will add by saying that we need to have leaders who are not afraid to speak truth to power. As part of the colonial legacy, we often like to toe the line, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. But we have to know within ourselves, as chiefs, as principals, as teachers, what we stand for, what we know as professionals within the system, and tell it to our superiors in a respectful manner. Eduardo, we are guided by this colonial framework. We can't get away from that. But as I said when I spoke earlier, we have to look at ourselves, who we are, where are we going? What do we want for ourselves? What do we want for our children? I recognize that it's not a case of just towing the line. We have to think outside the box. We have to say what is right, believe what is right, and then do what is right. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have two other questions on the floor, the lady in the blue first, then our lady in front here, and I take note of a colleague, but before, okay, all right. So we have three waiting. So two, and then we'll get to the three. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning, and thanks for two wonderful presentations. I almost wanted to say amen. I'm not, let me just say, I'm not an education specialist. Everything I've learned is through osmosis with working with Ida May, Martin, and Paul. I come from the finance background. So what I wanted to ask, particularly to Dr. Bradshaw, some of our countries are among the most highly indebted in the region. And this transformation program that you described is far ranging, and I would imagine cost a lot of money, expensive. And you would have had to have a discussion with your Ministry of Finance. If we were to give us some advice as some countries moving on to the process, what would be some of the critical areas you think that we should tackle first to give us the most bang for our buck in terms of achieving some of the objectives? And since you have already started the process, what are some of the lessons that you have learned in terms of the strategies and the tactics, not in terms of what you've done in teaching or not, but in terms of the whole approach that you have used in selling the idea to the public and getting the whole of society acceptance of the transformation that you have described? Thanks.
All right, thank you for your question. In terms of finance, I would recommend that we not focus on our ministries of finance to fund any education transformation alone. We have to look for external partners. There are many countries out there that are willing to assist us as developing countries in transforming the education system. In Barbados, we have had conversations with organizations outside, for example, the US. We are consulting with the British High Commission, the US Embassy, anybody who's interested in being a part of this education transformation. Now, in terms of lessons learned, one of the biggest lessons that we learned is that education transformation cannot happen just like that. It is a process, it is a journey, but we understand we have to start. And we have to start by getting our partners on board. We have to get the teachers on board. There's a book by Pratt, who was a curriculum specialist, and he said that implementation can be a great barrier reef, which means that you can have all of these plans that can fall apart at the implementation stage. And it's for this reason that we have made a concerted effort to bring teachers on board. We have to start with the leaders, let them have the vision and so on, but to get the teachers on board, get the parents on board, get everybody on board on this transformation train. It is not a Ministry of Education alone effort.
Thanks for that. We do have another question.
Thank you. Good morning. Congratulations on your presentation. As we gather here this morning to think of transforming education and listening to your presentations, I am thinking whether we should be concentrating on just education or should we be looking at development and thinking that education is just one aspect of holistic development of an individual. Now, as you said, in building 21st century skills, we cannot do it with the 19th century approach. We are here at the Ritz-Carlton. We will appreciate that the most important part of this building would have been the foundation. And so we need to start looking at the foundation years of an individual. We speak of formal education starting at 5 years. Are we starting too late? Should we be thinking of formal development and beginning earlier than 5 years? In agriculture, we plant a seed, we ensure that there is good soil, fertilizer. But when it comes to our human beings, I think we start too late. So in transforming education, I think we need to start thinking of transforming development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before you come in, thank you. Before you respond, I just want to flag two things. Well, three. We have 5 minutes left for our sessions. We have 3 questions on the floor waiting, and we still have to do the wrap up with the visual summary. So if I can ask you to take note of your response, I'm going to ask those 3 persons who do have their questions to quickly state your question or comment, and then we will move on. So we have first our colleague from the Caribbean Union of Teachers, then our colleague here from the University of West Indies, Mona Campus, and then our colleague to the back from St. Kitts, yeah? Dominica, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bristol. Good morning, colleagues. Excellent presentations as usual. Love hearing you all speak. The unions will always bring the ugly P word into the picture. That is power. Because part of the colonial legacy is that we are trying to demonstrate power over individuals. Dr. Bradshaw mentioned you have to get the teachers to buy in. And that means we need to let go of some of that power and engage the unions. And they could also prove to be courageous leaders. That's one. The second thing, very quickly, we had the test summit. We are having ours now. Predating that, however, was our HRD 2030 strategy. How are we going to, as a region, based on what Professor Warrican said, integrate the HRD to make sure we have a regional philosophy for education going forward to build our region? Thank you.
Thank you. So our colleague from UWI, Mona.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for these presentations, Prof. and Doctor. We were told this morning by Davian that we were an army, and I must say, on a train. I am one of those that's battle weary. I've been in the education sector for over 30 years, working OECS harmonization, all of these things. We have sat in rooms, said amen, all of these things. And, some words have changed. But my question is, what are some of our key lessons from those last exercises? Because one of the things I'm looking at is that our system seems to be intractable in so many ways, including teachers and how teachers teach. I'm a researcher, so one of the things that we did for mathematics was look from the 1800s, come to the present in Jamaica, and look at what are the things that we're seeing in mathematics teaching and learning. And guess what? More things change, the more they remain the same. So for me, not being pessimistic, I'm not, because I've been in these rooms for decades and years at different levels. I just want to find out, what are we going to do to get the results that we are talking about? Because it seems very idealistic. And, I like to talk about the elephants in the room. What really, how are we going to achieve those goals? I've heard about politics, governments. In my mind, I'm sitting here and I'm not seeing it happening in the present or even in the near present, especially with politics, politicians, etc. I'm just asking a difficult question because that's what we are here to do, ask questions. What have we learned, the key thing? What have we learned and how are we going to make this work this time around?
Thank you. So I would ask Professor Walker and Dr. Bradshaw to just take note of those key points when we come back to you, and we'll take our third question here.
Okay, good morning. I have quite a bit of questions, especially for
You're
Dr.
allowed.
Walker,
You're allowed one.
but I will stick to one, yes. For years, we have been speaking about assessment for, of, and as learning. And we want to end assessment of learning. However, what is the alternative? At the primary school level, we can take away the grade 6 national assessment, the common entrance exams, replace that with continuous assessment, that's fine. When the students go to secondary school, at the end of secondary school, what replaces CSET? What is the standard? When they move on to UE, what replaces the final coursework, the final exam, because UE has coursework and exam. What replaces that? When our students go out of the region, okay, primary school, they're into continuous assessment. We replace CSET with continuous assessment. UE decides to use coursework instead of continuous, final exam. When our students go out of the region, what replaces that? For years, I've been trying to find an answer. I am an assessment person from UE. I have been trying to find the answer. When you find that answer, Dr. Warrican or anybody, please let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One, please hold, Professor Warkan. Yes, Ms. Misha Small-Bartley.
Good morning, everyone. Excellent presentation. As we embark on decolonizing education, I could not help but think about the fact that the education system exists in a wider socio-ecological system that is literally dictated by inequality and inequity. How do we now bridge that gap? Because at the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level, and everything in between is impacted on the education system.
Thank you for that. So a lot for Professor Warrican and Dr. Bradshaw to respond to. So Dr. Bradshaw, I'll ask you to go first and then followed by Professor Warrican.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bristol. The first comment that dealt with the pre-primary education, that was an excellent point. And as part of the education transformation agenda, we are seeking to universalize pre-primary education, allowing 3-year-olds to go into school and gain that foundation using play-based approaches. We recognize that at that age, children grasp things very easily and very quickly. We want to be able to build their confidence. We want them to be able to ask questions. We want to encourage all of these things at that very young age so that when they go into the primary school, it's an easy transition. So that was an excellent point. There was another point made about engaging the unions. And I must say that this is something that we have embarked upon in an intentional way over the past 3 years. Bringing the unions to the table, discussing with them matters related to curriculum, matters related to teachers, matters related to violence, bringing them on board so that they understand what the Ministry of Education is doing, they understand the ministry's aims, and that the ministry itself understands where they're coming from as well. Then there was a question related to moving towards a regional approach, as opposed to doing things country by country. I fully agree with that. I will let you tackle that, Warrican. In terms of the key lessons, the question that came from this side, she was talking about the elephant in the room. And I like elephants, because how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So you're not going to see the change immediately, but we recognize that something must be done. We recognize research must be done to find out what the problem is. We don't want to put plasters on things that are not sores. So we have to find out where the problems are and tackle it one bit at a time. You spoke about being a mathematics teacher and seeing things move from one thing to the other thing and back to the same thing that it was originally. What I've recognized about mathematics, and just give me a minute and a half to talk about this, is that many teachers teach mathematics in a very abstract way. Why? Because they're trying to prepare the students for the exam. We live in a very exam-driven society. So 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 of what? And 2 of what? Right? So what we have to do, we have to look back at the theories, the old-time teachers use some of these theories, so the Piagetian approach and the Vygotskian approach. Piagetian meaning moving from the concrete to the more abstract, but teachers want to start at the abstract and don't ever meet the concrete. You see what I'm saying? So we have to start using these kinds of approaches, allowing children to ask questions and work together so that mathematics itself can have meaning. And we are starting to do that as well in Barbados. We are starting. We are not there yet, but we will get there. So I don't want you to be disheartened. Keep pressing on and keep encouraging your colleagues. Next thing, the question about what replaces CSEC, and you said something about ending assessment of learning. It is not about ending assessment of learning. We still want to assess learning, but the question is, how are we assessing learning? If a student scores 15% in a common entrance exam, does it mean that the student has not learned? Or does it mean that the student is not able to put the information on a sheet of paper as we want? If you quiz that child in another way, that child may end up getting 95%. So what we are being driven by is the fact that each child matters. Every child learns differently. So let us incorporate other modes of assessment in addition to, we're not replacing, in addition to the written examination. That is what we are proposing. The moment we remove the written exam, we are disadvantaging those who can do well using the written exam. And then you ask the question about CSEC. We are not going to throw away, well, Barbados, I don't know about the other countries, but we are not proposing to throw away CSEC. We are proposing to use other methods of assessing students. You ask about university. Now, while the students are learning using different modalities, they're building confidence, aren't they? They're building confidence because they're learning using the modalities that best suit them. And then all the while, you will be able to help build their competence in other aspects as well, maybe the written form. So at UE, they may still have more written exams, maybe, but at least now their confidence is built to a degree that they can write an exam. Imagine a student being in primary school, not being able to write well, and being told, I don't know if y'all have this in other Caribbean countries, you don't see. Sit to the back of the class. Y'all know what don't see mean? All right. Sit to the back of the class and not being paid any money. You know what happens to that child year after year after year after year? By first form or by 11, 12 years old, that child has no will to learn, no drive to learn. So why can't we build the foundation, as my friend over there said, from 3 years old all the way up to 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, so that when they go now to write the other exams out, they're not only confident, but they're able to articulate what they know and what they have learned. I'm sorry. All right, so education is indeed, and the system is a microcosm of society. We can't separate it. We cannot, okay, I'm wrapping up now. I'm wrapping up. We can't separate it. So this is the reason we need to bring everybody on board. We need to communicate with the parents, especially. I've never seen a school in a labor ward. It's the mothers and the fathers who we need to get on board on this train, according to my friend, so that they understand where we want to take our countries, they understand where we want to take our region, and they put their hands to the plow with the rest of us so that we can create, as we say in Barbados, a bright future for every child. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
right.
Bradshaw. Professor Warkan?
I'll be very brief. The point was made about not thinking about it from an educational point of view only, but more broader. And I do support that. Right now, we are doing some research at the Research Center for the Growth Council of Barbados that looks at some of the things that are in schools. So do they have financial literacy? Do they do health literacy, entrepreneurship, and so forth? With a view that if they're present, it augurs well for the economy and so forth. Because if you have a good health literate child, they'll make, hopefully, wise decisions, which will then cost the government less money when it comes to health. And same thing with finances, you wouldn't go taking crazy loans and so forth. And we are then doing some modeling to show with these things present how it affects the community. In terms of the power issue, I do agree that there's a contestation of power. And I believe in, yeah, I believe that power has to lie in diverse ways. The parents need power. The teachers need to have power. The children need to have power. If we're talking diversity and inclusivity, we have to think about power from a broad perspective. You can't have a child who feel powerless in the classroom. I wouldn't go too much into this. HRD, I think, yes, we are at the point where we have to think about it regionally, and maybe this meeting is a type of meeting that we can use to think about how do we converge? What do we do? Lois, I noticed you asked about empowerment, the lessons that we have learned. In my time in the region, a major lesson that I've learned is that when we listen to teachers, when we empower teachers, when we take the best practice and good practice of teachers, it has synergistic effect. We had something that was funded by USAID called SET. And one of the things we did at the end of every year is to take the top teachers and principals who have got good results, and we took them to an all-inclusive hotel. We wine them, we dine them, and then they shared with us what is it they do that made a difference. And we document. And out of this, we write. So we came up with a text of teaching literacy. But you know what? These came from the practices of the teachers. They didn't just come from what anybody told us. What is an alternative to high stakes exams? Well, I just want to make it very clear that in my talk, I never advocate for not having certain types, but I'm saying that there must be multiple ways of assessing. The common entrance, that is the one that need not be how it is. You can have an assessment, but not an assessment to place in a type of school, but an assessment to say, as the child goes into secondary school, this is what we need to ensure that they have. A file that follows them so that we know how to help the child. And the last thing, how do we bridge the gap of classism and so forth? Well, I remember as a kid, poor family. My mother, my father who had big dreams for me, drilling what university I should go to, and so forth. But his words were always, education is the great equalizer. So what we really need to do is to do education, but do it well. If we do it badly, we continue to promote elitism. And we have to be practical. Elitism would always be there. But if we do it well, we narrow that gap because we're getting more children with greater opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As you know, we are live streaming, so we have people in the background who are doing artwork for us, and our visual summary is ready. So I'll ask our colleagues to put up that visual summary of the conversation that we had this morning around indigenizing and decolonizing education for national and regional transformation. I see the cameras are out and you're taking your pictures, but I think 2 points that I would want to leave you with as we recognize that there is power in education and we have to navigate and manage that power in education effectively. And as we recognize that education transformation is equal to social change. And therefore, when we are thinking and talking about education transformation, we are thinking and talking and living a bridging of the gap for social justice and equity. Colleagues, join me in saying thank you to Professor Warakan and Dr. Ramona Bradshaw. They have gotten us off to a fantastic start, and we are now moving into our break before we navigate into our breakout rooms in our keynote dialogue sessions. Thank you very much.